So here is Joe Melvin with me. Joe is the world expert on Barry Flanagan, and we're so lucky to have you here tonight, but to have had you on the journey that brought us to the opening of this exhibition, the most comprehensive exhibition of Barry Flanagan's work to date, and a huge privilege to have it here in Birmingham, where Flanagan had been an art student in the 1950s. It's a kind of lovely closing of a circle in a way, and so much that was referred to in the film. Flanagan's love of poetry, Flanagan's reference to dancing. Such a sad sort of observation. The choice of the work, the films of Flanagan when he was younger. We see him planting a kind of bollard like guerrilla artist somewhere in Camden. We see the sexy sand girl, we see the conceptual work here, we see this. Joe's been so involved in the public programme, the selection of the work, the choice of the music. We've got Gavin Bryars coming up, we just had David Toop, we've had Bach, cello, Suites 1 and 3, and tonight we had this film. And it was Joe's choice to screen the film, and the first question, Joe, is what was it that made you choose this one?
Okay, I think because when we heard recently that Roger might not be able to come, I thought that it might be nice, or might be quite appropriate, to have Barry's presence here, because it would have been invoked differently. I mean, I say obviously I knew him. It's not obvious I knew him. I did know him, but for a sculptor who worked alongside him to be talking about the way they collaborated and how they collaborated became obviously a different thing. And so, because that wasn't going to be possible, I thought that it would be a nice thing, or a good thing, to have Barry's presence, his physical presence, in this film. And as Jonathan said, it sort of demonstrates his interests and his continuing engagement with the sort of fluidity of practice, the whole kind of the way the hands work, the way the hand molds clay, his preoccupation and love for Japan, which comes through with these pots that he was making right up until he could no longer use his hands anymore. And then the way that he picks up the clay balls and throws them at the wall, which is actually a sort of reference to a very early work that he made when he was at St. Martin's, in frustration with a particular interpretation of sculpture not including sound. And so he was struggling with this clay work, and in this discussion that sculpture didn't include sound, he picked up a quite big lump of clay and hurled it at the wall. And you can just imagine that clay, the noise it made when it hit the wall, and then how it fell down, and that whole sort of gesture. And the other students apparently didn't say anything at this point. They were kind of stunned. This is how Barry remembered that occasion. But he said, "What's that?" And that was it. What's that? And so I felt that this was a very kind of poetic reimagining of that action, that gesture, that movement of the embracing of sculpture as a three-dimensional experience which includes sound, and that whole notion of the hurling, the dance, the gesture.
There's the kind of the arc across the entire breadth of his career. I mean, this is Flanagan months, I think, before he died.
Yeah, it's literally. I mean, it was actually filmed in May, and he died at the end of August. So it's actually very close before.
And then we see him reenacting this
Yes.
throwing of the clay across the room.
Yeah.
So, a reference to him as an art student. After he left Birmingham, he went to London to the to Central St Martin's, and that's actually where he learned to play the cello, interestingly.
Yeah.
But the fact that you can see in this film at the very end of his life a reference to what he was doing at the very beginning reinforces strongly the proposition of this exhibition, where we put together what are often perceived to be two very distinct halves of a career. The early conceptual work, which of course is incredibly that's the word, it's tangible, and you can feel the stuff that beguiled him, the fabrics and the sand, etc. This kind of the basic sort of stuff of the object world, and then the casting of the bronze sculptures. A casting I think he would have first encountered in Birmingham. Is that right?
He did learn the processes of casting in Birmingham, absolutely.
Yeah, so there again you've got this kind of, I keep on referring to circles, and it comes around again.
Yeah.
So this was something that we felt very strongly. When we first met, incidentally, in Japan, and started thinking about this exhibition, and we both kind of pounced on the ideas that we would go with the combination of the hares and the earlier work. Because until now, if you think of the Tate retrospective, well, it was not really a retrospective because it was only the...
It was only a
it was the
portion,
early stuff.
Yeah.
So it was a kind of resistance to the hares and the other bronze work. And then, of course, other people think of Flanagan as the guy who does the hares. And this exhibition is very much an assertion of an artist who... it's not like he was repudiating himself. I mean, you can see it in the film as well. He's, it's a whole person that we're looking at.
Yeah, I know, absolutely. And there's another connection with Birmingham, which I think is something would be rather good to talk about, and that is the Barber Institute. In 1980. Barry Flanagan had an exhibition in Edinburgh, and it was with David Brown. And David took him to a couple of exhibitions. One was in Edinburgh, looking at a medieval suit of armour, which he posted a postcard after this event to Barry. And then the other was a visit to the Barber Institute and picking up a postcard of a Corinthian helmet, which he also posted to Barry. And then a few weeks later, Flanagan wrote him a note saying how fruitful that armour was, the experience of that armour, and how the Corinthian helmet became the notion, the model, the reference for the helmet, the hare-on helmet. And this was made, very, very, very early in the formation of the hares, and Flanagan had started doing drawings of hares in like a few months before he made these two gilded works, the one that's there and the one that's around the corner. And that was sort of towards the autumn, in the autumn of 1979. And he did this one of, in effect, two tortoises that were facing outwards with their shells, like heaps. And then a sort of anthropomorphic, morphological hare that was almost like a frog, leaping over these two heaped tortoises, looking forwards. And I think it's very interesting because that iconography and the shape, if you like, of the helmet and the shape that iterates the pile of sand. He hadn't seen the helmet, or he hadn't seen that particular helmet, or maybe he had when he was a student, but he hadn't remembered it specifically. And then it was that seeing it in that postcard and in that visit that he had that kind of gave another edge to that situation, which I think is Coming back to Birmingham again.
Yeah, I'd like to think that, if he was looking down on us, he'd be sort of happy to know that it happened here.
In Birmingham, yeah.
And in the light of the observations that we've made and others have made, it's a question I've never asked you, but when he started making the hares, did other people, challenge him about that? As if he had somehow betrayed his younger self, and did he have a response to it?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to kind of reflect back to that time of 1979, 1980, and what was actually happening at that time, and how a lot of, the pure conceptual project had, in a way, become, it was repeating itself. So it had become perhaps less dynamic or interesting. And so this kind of return, to use that expression, or this kind of re-emergence of something that is graspable, which I hesitate to use the word, but it's useful, figurative. I hesitate to use it because Flanagan hated it. He hated those terms, figuration and abstraction. He said everything is both figurative and abstract. It's impossible not to be. So that sort of return at that point was, think of the new spirit in painting at the Royal Academy of, was it 1980 or 1981? And that kind of re-investigation in something that was moving towards a kind of shamanistic, powerful reconnection with something more primordial, less pure, more, in a way, dirty. I think it was probably at the time as shocking as when he put sand on a carpeted floor in 1966, because this use of bronze, even at that time when he did it, Caro was saying he wouldn't use it. So Flanagan was always sort of resisting that predictable, to use another kind of hackneyed phrase, predictable approach to making sculpture. So this kind of resistance of, why not? Let's actually make something that people can relate to immediately. And bear in mind that we have some slides here which actually include 3 sculptures that were destroyed by the public in their situations. And the last one that was destroyed was in Cambridge, when Flanagan was one of the artists who was selected for the Peter Stuyvesant City Sculpture Project. And you see the Cambridge one. It's got the color slides, and you have 4 columns of essentially sandbags, which are covered with resin. These ones, and this was absolutely destroyed within a few days of being installed, and a few days of its situation. And it was a vicar in a local parish who made a sermon saying, "Blow up revolting art." And some undergraduates from one of the college took the challenge and really did. They dismantled the sculpture. Bits of it were found in the junior common room of one of the colleges. And this had an incredibly strong effect on Flanagan. He was absolutely devastated that people would...
What year was it?
This was 1972. And he was devastated at this destruction. And this was the 3rd sculpture that had been destroyed. The other 2 were sand works. One was outside Camden, outside Swiss Cottage Library, and it was part of a Camden public sculpture exhibition. That was in 1969, and it was a series of sandbags. You'll see it. They were all kind of big sandbags with a big long one on the top of it, and that was ripped to shreds, and all the sand went all over the place. Yeah, that one. Yeah. And then there was another one which was called 3-ton sandpiece, which was made with 3 tons, which was on a beach in Cornwall, Holywell Beach. And that became the target practice of the army who were training on the beach. And again, that was a year before, that was in 1967. And it had also a very distressing effect on Flanagan. He said, why did they hate it? Why did they hate it so much that they wanted to flatten it? What was their problem with it? So I think these things sort of definitely kind of generate this relationship with the community, relationship with the exposure of the work in its public situation. So the publication in the same year of The Leaping Hare by George Ewart, which compiles gamekeepers and poachers' stories about animals, obviously hares, but other animals as well, and their sort of oral histories with myths of the hare from all different countries. That was published in the same year as the destruction of the sculpture in Cambridge. And it was a book that Flanagan had from that time, from 1972. Now, I'm certainly not saying that he then thought about making hare sculptures. I'm not saying that at all. But I would say that the destruction of the work made him rethink what is the function of the sculpture. He always talked about the ethical concerns of the artist. What is this function?
It comes through very strongly in the book that we published. It's this small one, which is full of writing statements by Flanagan as well as poetry, and the strong sort of his ethical position, and what he feels is integrity, sort of comes across very clearly. Also, there's a story of seeing a hare. When he first saw a hare and what it meant to him. And in the light of what you just described and the way he was kind of latching onto the hare at that time, I mean, this is before other works we have in this exhibition that have got nothing to do with hares, but you can see the correspondence between them. For example, on the floor, second floor in Gallery 4, you see a hare on that sort of pyramid of steel lengths, and you see it against a backdrop with the branches, the hazel branches, and the felt. I mean, it's the formal correspondence is strong, but also the correspondence between Flanagan himself and the hare. The way he thought of himself before he was actually modelling and casting them, that he perhaps identified with the hare as a particular kind of creature. Do you want to say more about that, and how how hare-like he was?
Well, there's the Middle English poem, The Names of the Hare, which goes through all these characteristics of the hare, the slippery nature, how it shifts between beings. It's a trickster. It's a thief, it's a lover, it's everything in one go, and it completely transforms itself constantly and totally. And he actually did do a project with Seamus Heaney around the names of the hare, when they published a poster with Seamus Heaney's kind of putting into contemporary language this poem, and it had leaping hares in it. It was a rather nice way to make a poster, a rather interesting collaboration. The stillness of the hare, the fact that it moves so fast and then it has this kind of leap and it sort of almost like freezes in time, this instantaneity is something that was very much present in Flanagan's approach to like dance, and also in his approach to the concrete poetry that he wrote, which would be punctuated by incredible silences. So like the sort of passages, if you think of the passages of the hare and the movement of the hare as a motion thing, a durational thing, and those instances of being frozen in time, like being repeated in this actual declamation of poetry within space. And when he was very active in concrete poetry, he performed many pieces which included silent poems, which were literally the articulation of the shape of a letter through his lips, so that there would be a feeling of the connection between the air going in to breathe, and then what comes out with the letter. So it's real kind of focusing in on something very intense, but always changing, which is like the hare.
It was the poetry really that kind of turned me on to this project when we were making presentations at this symposium in Japan on support for young artists in the archive. I mean, it's a kind of weird combination of subject matter, but we just sailed on through. And Joe gave a presentation about managing the archive of Flanagan, and amongst the pieces that she showed was the work that we have upstairs. It's a sequence of slides, and it's Flanagan reciting the mantra of awoken powers, and the idea that he was performing with a rock band in a pub in Dublin and saying things like, then thought the thoughts I thought that I never thought, and made the promises I made that I never made, then broke the hearts I broke that I never broke, and kissed the lips I kissed that I never kissed. I mean, it's incredibly kind of poetic, and I never had this sort of this is a kind of dimension to Flanagan that had never occurred to me before, and the idea that we could somehow, we could make an exhibition and we could kind of convey this to other people appealed so strongly. And then other pieces in the show as well. I mean, these collages, and then the fingerprint works upstairs as well that we've, you're seeing this stuff for the first time. It's incredibly exciting for a curator to be able to actually sort of unveil it for an audience. Also, I'm thinking too, the way that poetry pervades the exhibition, the poetry and then the dancing, and the music. You see the image of the decrepit hare in the last room, which is like an old, worn-out creature against the thinking hare with the dancers on top. I mean, and again, there's the hares can be all kinds of things, and you get to the last room in the exhibition, and I think you get a really strong, concentrated dose of that understanding. Don't you? It's so good.
Yes, it was very remarkable with the performance of the cello suites in that space, with the combination between the sculptures which were on the edge of shamanistic existence at that point during the performance. It was as if something else took place. And I don't think it was simply because those cello suites were very specific to Flanagan himself. It was something about the acoustics of the music and how that resonated through the space with these dancing hares that were beside where the performer was playing.
Yeah, this was a performance that was made by Jia-Xin Cheng, Jia-Xin Lloyd Webber, in fact, who is again, a world-renowned interpreter of Bach. This actually was inspired by me asking you what kind of music did Flanagan like, and I said, was it jazz? And you said, well, yes, but it was really classical music that he liked, and Bach in particular. And then we had the hare with the hare with the cello outside. Yeah, and exactly. I thought, wouldn't it be great if we actually had somebody performing the cello in the show? And the cello, I mean, he learned to play the cello, as I said. The cello keeps on occurring in his work. What was it about that particular instrument that appealed, do you think?
Oh, I mean, he loved the cello. I mean, he wanted to play it, and so he was very lucky in being able to get a grant while he was studying sculpture, to actually get a grant to do the cello at the Guildhall. So he played it quite well. I mean, obviously not professionally, but I think it was its bodily character. I mean, he couldn't live without a cello. He travelled an awful lot, and he stayed in different places. He had different, he would have a studio in various different countries, and he had to have a cello in each of these places. He had to have it so that he could be able to play it, and it was that closeness to it, I'm sure, the very embracing physicality of that instrument.
Well, we see the torso in Ibiza, and then we see the cello in the same film, and
sure.
The cello is so torso-like. And then the incredibly difficult moment where he writes and says, I've lost my grip, that would have not only enabled him to make, but it was the last hare that we saw being made, but to then sort of carry on, but also, unable, presumably, then to play the cello.
But there was something, absolutely, but there was something about that. Don't worry about glasses. It doesn't matter. There was something about that the torso in that sculpture, with the Collinus poem, that is another iteration of a work that Flanagan made, which he destroyed when he was, when about 1970. But he made out of clay a very kind of like mannequin-esque torso, and then he put like bandages around it, like a kind of sculptural version of a Magritte, and then he photographed it, and he included it in a artist's page in Studio International magazine, and it's quite interesting because it's very much that work of Magritte, of the torso face. And then he's putting blindfold across the breast. Flanagan did, and that featured as a photo, as a sort of photo of that sculpture that he disappeared. And Roger remembered actually seeing that, and he came into the studio and said, "My God, what on earth's that?" And he didn't say anything about it, because the next time he was there, it wasn't there; it had gone.
How funny.
Yeah.
It's such a shame he's not here.
Oh, well.
But we're here, and you're here, and I'm wondering if this is maybe not the right psychological moment to open up. I mean, we can go on talking forever, as we have done, and I have to say, the mellowness of our conversation reflects the fact that I'm actually feeling rather sad, that we're not carrying on curating this show, because it's been such an enjoyable adventure. Now, here is a chance for you to ask Jo. Well, you can ask me some questions, but she is much more knowledgeable on the subject. So please don't hesitate. Anything that's kind of occurring to you, observations that you want to make, something that we said that you're convinced is wrong, some burning question that's been burning in your mind for years. I mean, you can always rely on Lindsay to ask a question. Show you how it's done. Lindsay.
I just wanted to say, having lived with the exhibition for a few weeks now, it's just the weight of the objects that is so satisfying for me, and the hares themselves, particularly the one that's on the second floor, the large hare on the structure. And I just wondered if you might say something about that, because obviously there's a grace to his work, there's this defiance of gravity, but then there's this kind of weight and this bodily mass and this literalism that kind of kicks in, and there's something almost kind of uncanny about that, and I can really relate to it, and I find it very satisfying to look at and be around.
Thank you. Thank you. I agree. I think if you pick up those two muslin sandbags then and feel their weight, they have this incredible physicality and that of the body. And filling these sandbags here, which has to be done, by two people holding and filling, they are like body parts, and they have a natural weight which falls in a particular way. It kind of falls in its own way, and I think the weightiness of the sculptures is intrinsic to to them. It's absolutely inseparable from what they are. And the way that he talked about the weight of the hare, a real hare, not a live hare, a dead hare, when he had one in his studio, was how he compared it with the weight of pheasants, and that it was like the weight of 7 pheasants. And I think that it's an interesting way to think about weight, the weight of the animal, the weight of these things, the weight of the pheasants that are kind of all over the country and that are being caught by gamekeepers and poachers, and that actually to think of it like that, because you can't really get away from it. You can't really escape that weight, our physical weight, our being. He talks a lot about uprightness and the three-dimensionality of us, and how it seemed as an artist, the only way to approach the thing of making work was to embrace one's three-dimensionality. So somehow to live with one's weight.
Yeah, I mean, the verticality that was occurring in those works, the ones that were destroyed that you were referring to, and the bollard that we have that were, upstairs just before you enter the last gallery, I mean, they're really significant. I mean, and they are like symbols of an upright, conscious human body. But then you have, the body that's unconscious, the body that is sort of let go. These sacks of sand, for example. Where there's no volition there. Yeah. I mean, you've got the two things very much in contrast. And it always strikes me as being weird the way people refer to the early work as conceptual when it. I mean, I was saying this earlier, when it is so much about physical, something in the real world.
Yeah, and also there's a playfulness in those works. Those works. I mean, there's a playfulness in these folds. How these folds literally crease and go round, and the sort of the kind of shape of them, the line, the quality of line that happens in those folds, and the way that in a very simplistic way, but a very profound way, riffs on the purity of minimalism, the purity of that sort of repetition. And then you can actually make this very simple repetition with something like these folds of blankets, which he had the idea of the folds of blankets when he opened his laundry cupboard. And then he was thinking about how similar his laundry cupboard was to a space in the British Museum, which had Egyptian sheets folded up. And so, this kind of, this everydayness of what we actually have in our houses, in our homes, and what we encounter of our physical existence is something that finds its way in the production of his work.
Any other questions from you? Yes, there's one there in the back row.
Yeah, hi Joe. I just wanted to ask a question about this kind of move from working in a conceptual way to working with traditional materials, and that kind of reversing of things, or this sort of a cyclical thought being perhaps a pataphysical way of thinking.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think the poem that Jonathan was quoting, of the contrary, the proposition and then the counter proposition that it happened but it didn't happen, is something about this kind of generative approach to making work that it keeps on going in this way, and it is always going to find another way to come back, and that it's going to like the sort of weight of the body that's leaning against something. It's going to find a way to remain there somehow. So the return to, or the use of so-called traditional materials, I think, was done in a way that was as investigative as the use of sand or building materials. So that, working with stone and making, actually literally, making those marks in stone and using quarries was a material investigation, a material exploration, just like sand or rope had that quality of being itself that he pointed to with the way that he was making work. So that he showed it, so that it spoke, so that it made was its own thing. I mean, one of the things that we use is the way he talks about the work being precocious, like a child. It has its own existence. It's there. It's been presented.
Any other questions, observations to make? Something in the film that that's kind of inescapable. I mean, he's losing his grip, but he's so with it, and you can see this, extraordinary sort of life and twinkle, naughtiness in his eyes. You knew him towards the end of his life, and I imagine you went to see him on Ibiza.
Yeah, many times.
Yeah, and I imagine. I never met Flanagan, and I don't know if anybody here in the audience did, but I mean, there was something so kind of irrepressible, sort of about him, and you see in his face, although he hasn't got the physical strength anymore, the same kind of person that was there jumping out of the lorry, onto the streets. Casting and then situating this bollard. Yeah. Like some kind of not a vandal exactly, but he's doing something that he's not supposed to do.
A very deft strategist. I mean, he went so fast in the motorized wheelchair that he had in Ibiza. He went unbelievably fast. I've never seen one go so fast. It was quite a feat.
Okay, well, I think in light of that observation about how things were towards the end of his life, and I have to say it's an incredibly poetic film, and it's fantastic that you gave us a chance to see it. Thanks a lot for your attention, and thanks to our learning team for sort of making this possible. In absentia, thanks to Barry Flanagan, and here in our presence, Joe Melvin. Thanks.
Thank you very much.